Hi everyone, my name is Sophie Hunter and I'm a fellow in the Art Conservation Unit of the Museum of New Mexico in Santa Fe. Today we're just going to be talking about a few different methods to make internal moccasin supports or moccasin stuffings. Before I start, I just want to say that there's no one way or one right way to make a moccasin insert. So, you might develop a way that you think works really well for you and your collection. I'll be presenting on a method that I've used in several different museums for a really long time, where I had to produce work really fast for a large number of moccasins. So it was really useful. And then when I was in school with Nicole, Nicole taught me a method of stuffing moccasins that I hadn't known before that's really amazing. So she's going to present on that. So before, I'm going to do kind of like a cooking show, and I'm going to tell you all the ingredients. Stockinette tubing. It comes in tan, white, it even comes in black. It is 100% cotton, so it's okay to have direct contact with the hide or the fabric that the moccasin is made out of. I usually use the 2-inch or 2.5-inch wide stockinette because I find when you get to the 3-inch, your stuffing can get a little bit loose. And you want to have a nice stuffing that's compact and will keep the shape that you want it to be. Second, we have 100% polyester batting, loose batting. So this is, and you can tell it's loose because you can just pull it apart really easily out of here. Gaylord sells a really nice one called polyfill or fiberfill. But if you find yourself needing to go to the fabric store, you can find this in the fabric store, although we do like to use materials that we know have been tested before for their archival qualities. If you have to go to the fabric store and get it, then just make sure that it's white, so it's not colored at all, that it's non-allergenic, and that it says 100% polyester. You want to make sure that it doesn't feel hard or like there are any weird additives to it. It should be nice and soft. This is also 100% polyester batting. But this type, you might find it on a roll inside of a collection storage or in the fabric store for like quilt making and stuff. But for the most part, we're going to be using this one all the time. And then you have your needle and thread. So I use 100% cotton, silk, or polyester thread. So you don't really want to use a thread that's made out of like rayon or nylon, because those materials will deteriorate and they'll lose their strength over time. So a really good brand is one called Scala, that's S-K-A-L-A. This is a material, it's a spun bonded olefin fiber, but you refer to it as soft Tyvek. We are going to use a USDA food grade trash bag. So this is not one, this is just from the ice bucket in the hotel room, because I didn't have one with me. But if you go on like a website like Uline, they sell clear trash bags, and all you need to do is make sure it says USDA, FDA food grade, and that it's polyethylene, and so that's actually archival. So before we go into the methods, just a few notes about stuffing. It's really beneficial to stuff out our moccasins sometimes, because we know that, for instance, when moccasins are stored flat, they can develop creases. And then we all know that some hide, depending on how it was tanned, can harden with time. And so if those creases harden, then it might be really hard to display those moccasins in the future because they'll be too fragile. So it's nice to give our moccasins some support, some internal support. However, we do have to take a lot into consideration when we make an internal support for a moccasin, because our goal is to just provide enough support to keep the structure from changing negatively. So we want to just maintain its original structure, give it support, but we don't want to stuff it so much that we're actually changing its structure. Because leather, or hide, is very, very supple. So in our museum storage, we might have fluctuations in temperature and humidity, and our hide can actually change shape and take on the shape of whatever we put inside of it. So that being said, we want to make sure that our stuffings aren't really bulgy or uneven, because they can take on those shapes. but also that we don't overstuff the moccasins, because those moccasins can actually stretch and lose their shape. And that's really bad, because those moccasins might have important characteristics, like the moccasins might actually have the shape of the person's foot that wore them in them. So if we overstuff them, you might lose that. And also, overstuffing moccasins puts a lot of stress on, for instance, the threads and the sinew that the beadwork might be done with. So it might lead to the loss of beads, but also it might put stress on quill work and might lead to quill work snapping or even hide tearing. So our goal is just to give it just enough stuffing to keep its structure, but not too much. Oh, and one more note. Just like I mentioned, like some moccasins, they might harden in a distorted shape, and they might become very, very fragile. And in that case, it might actually be dangerous to put an internal support into it. And in that case, it's always really good to consult your conservator or a conservator outside of the institution, because it's possible that if that moccasin needs to be stuffed, like for exhibit, for instance, that they may need to do a treatment beforehand, like a humidification treatment, to make it safe to handle. Also, sometimes a distortion in a moccasin might actually be part of that moccasin's history, and it might be valuable to its story. So in that sense, it's also good to consult your curator and make sure that everyone's on the same page about putting in internal supports. Here's a pair of shoes that was also stored without any support on the inside, so now they're hardened out of shape. And just a note on this one, these are a pair of shoes from a musician, Fats Domino, and they were in the New Orleans flood. And I was just stuffing out all the shoes in the collection, but when I found out these were going to go into the New Orleans exhibit at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, I immediately contacted the curator, because this is one of those cases where it's like, well, maybe the curator wants to show these shoes really worn out and damaged because that's what happened when they went through Katrina. In this case, she did want them to be stuffed, but that was just an example. A pair of boots that looked like they had something poking them in when they were stored. Here's a moccasin that was stored flat, and it had a really, really strong crease along the side and in the back. So these are just some examples of like why it's important to kind of take the time to make a nice stuffing, because the hide really can take on the shape of everything that you put inside of it. So let's go into, this is the first method we're going to show today, and it's just very basic, but this is the method that I use all the time. And we do it by starting with this 100% loose polyester batting, and I'm going to use, these are a pair of really nice moccasins made by a wonderful lady named Nina Sanders, and she's letting us borrow them for the workshop today. So this is about the size of the foot. And what we're going to do is just pull out thin layers of this polyester batting and lay them out and layer them. And the reason why we do this is because by pulling out the layers, you're kind of like releasing those fibers. And then when you layer them, those fibers are attaching to one another. So it keeps the shape of your moccasin stuffing, and it also creates that really nice smooth surface without any bumps or anything like that. So you're going to use a lot more than it looks like you think you need at first, because when you put the stockinette over it, it all gets a lot smaller. And of course you want to use less in the toe and more in the heel. These ones have like, they're pretty a low toe, so I probably wouldn't even use, hardly, I wouldn't make it very, very much in the toe. But I might, for this one, I might start with like this much and see if I need to put more. I know it looks like a lot, right? But then you pull the stockinette over it. So you're also going to want to cut your stockinette to be a lot longer than your batting, because when you put it in, it stretches and it gets a lot shorter. So you just cut a piece off, and you can put the batting inside the stockinette a number of different ways. Like some people like to roll it up and then just slowly unroll it over the batting. I've seen someone actually stick the batting into a tube and then put the stockinette over the tube and then pull out the tube. I usually just kind of like grab it with my hands, like this, and then slowly put the stockinette over. And then I kind of roll it the rest of the way. This is the part, if you're not in a rush, you can just take your time so you don't mess up the shape that you just made with the batting. Then once it's in there, you can kind of pull apart those fibers a little more, smooth them out, and everything like that, and so you get this kind of like nice, not bumpy surface at all. So then we want to cut it to size. And so our toe, it's more like an oval, and we want to cut it straight through the batting so that it looks like the batting's about to pop out. So for the toe, I usually cut kind of like a triangle. Did that pretty badly. Just like that, and it looks like all the batting's going to come out, but that's actually really important, because then when we sew the seam, you get a really nice tight seam without any extra loose stockinette hanging off. So I usually sew one side first. So before I sew, just to talk a little bit about seam lines, it may be instinctual to want to take this to a sewing machine because it's so fast, right? But the problem with a sewing machine is that, at least on one side, you can sew one side and then turn it inside out and then put your batting in. But at least on one side, you're going to have a pretty big seam line. So here's an example of a stockinette that was sewn on one side, and you can see that big seam line here. And if we sew it, we also want to try to make our seam to be really subtle and like invisible, if we can do that, as close to invisible as possible. And the reason for that is that even though it seems like maybe going too far, like you can even leave an impression with your seam line inside the moccasin. So, it's good not, and especially something this big could definitely leave a distortion inside the moccasin. So we strive to make these as seamless as possible. You can sew one side, cut the heel, you check your sizing, see if you need to add a little more, then cut the heel and sew the heel.
When you're checking the size, are you checking it, actually putting it in the moccasin, or are you just setting it on the side of the moccasin?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So depending on how, so Nicole asked if when I check the size, if I'm actually putting it in and taking it out. So that's a good point, because we definitely want to limit the amount of times we put the stuffing in and take it out. Like in an ideal world, we make the stuffing, put it in, and it never gets taken out. At the point I'm at now, I usually feel confident just sewing one side. I usually always sew the toe first and putting it next to it. And I might stick my hands in a little bit to like give it to see what the shape is like. And then I usually feel confident then making an estimation of where to cut it. However, when if you're new to doing moccasin stuffings and you're just starting out, then it's true you might need to put it inside just to really check it. Actually, especially on high moccasins, because on high moccasins, there's always this kind of awkward ankle space right here. So it's important to make sure that you have enough padding right here in the ends. You might realize when you put it in you need more, but you're aiming to not have to put it in and take it out. And if it's a really fragile moccasin, then definitely you want to try your best to estimate, so you only have to put it in once. And So the seam that I was taught by Angela McGrew at the Southwest Museum of the American Indian in Los Angeles, which is who taught me how to do these, is to, excuse my really unprofessional graphic, I'm sorry. But basically you secure the thread first on one side by just doing a few loops in the same area. And then you bring the thread in and out on one side, pull it over, and go in and out on the other side. So when you put it in and out on one side and in and out on the other side, when you pull it tight, the stockinette comes together like that. And you're left with a pretty flat, subtle seam. You might have a different seam that is more elegant, that you like better because you might have more sewing skills than I do. Like our textile conservator, she's way more experienced sewing than I am, so she actually pinned her stockinette first, whereas I didn't feel comfortable doing that. And she rolled it when I taught her how to do it. And I would just make sure if you roll it that there's not like too much of a bump right there. When it's time to put your fill into the moccasin, it's really helpful to have some tools. So I find that bone folders are usually the most helpful with this. They're really smooth and soft, but you can use anything. Like I made this little piece of wood that's really soft that works well. Here's a letter opener. I even use chopsticks a lot, like especially if it's really awkward. You know, you just kind of grab it by the sides and then lead it in with the chopsticks. So you can use all sorts of tools. And now for high moccasins. So there's a lot of different materials you can use for doing high moccasins, and I'm just going to go through a few of them really quickly. And I'll talk about these materials as we go through each one. So for low moccasins, I usually just make one insert for the foot. But for high moccasins, I'll make one insert for the foot and then one big insert either just for the ankle or for the ankle and the leg. So one way to do this is to use polyethylene foam. So this is a piece of polyethylene foam. It's commonly referred to as epifoam. But there's also a form of polyethylene foam that's really thin and it comes on a roll. So a lot of people use it to line the shelves in your museum storage. So that's it right here. One way to do it is just polyethylene foam is archival, and it's okay to be in a museum storage long term. It's even okay to have direct contact with your object. So this foam is okay. You can just roll it up until it's kind of the shape of your moccasin, and then stick it into a stockinette. And so in this case, I started rolling it up. And then for this higher leg area, I actually just put in a little bit of this polyester batting to kind of make it thicker at the top. And then pulled a stockinette over it and sewed the edges. So you can see it's nice and smooth and it's not bumpy at all. So it looks a lot better now. Now these moccasins were really, really heavy and thick, and they had that pretty strong crease down the side. So for these moccasins, I actually needed something a little more heavy duty than just Ethifoam or the loose batting. So I actually used this polyethylene foam plank to carve an insert for this one. Just to show you that crease. And before, you can see it was stuffed with just loose batting. And this is great because that actually was like lessening the crease a little bit. It was taking some stress off of the crease at least. But these moccasins were actually strong enough that they could be pushed a little bit further, and that crease could be lessened a little more, or decreased. So for this, you don't need to carve a perfect shape of a leg or anything. You just kind of see the space that's available inside, and then you cut a piece of Ethifoam that's smaller than that size. And then you can wrap the Ethifoam with a number of materials. So for these moccasins, I wrapped that piece with a little piece of thin felt. So like this stuff, yeah, 100% polyester felt. So I just rolled the felt around it. But you can also use the 100% polyester batting. You could roll it in this stuff too. And just to provide a little more cushion, so that way you don't need to carve a perfect leg. You can just carve a general shape and then surround it with some stuffing, and then that gives you a little bit more leeway. And then pull a stockinette over it. So you can see it was pushed a little bit more, but still safe. So that's how it looks now. And you can use that same method for moccasins that might require a stiff insert. So like for instance, this is a moccasin that was brought into the conservation lab, and it was very distorted. It was like almost in a U shape. And so one of the conservators humidified it to try to make it bring back its original shape a bit. So they actually asked if I could make a stiff insert to go inside it to kind of keep its shape a little better. So I just used the same method, but for a shoe. So I cut the shape of the foot, a general shape of a foot smaller, cut it into 3, and then I lined it with that loose batting, and then just pulled a stockinette over it. So those are like the 3 steps, just carving, batting, and stockinette, and then put them inside. And the reason I cut the foot into 3 pieces there is because then that makes it safe to remove the insert without harming any of the ankle. A stiff ethafoam support is also really good for moccasins that need to be wrapped. So because a lot of times, actually I just learned this, but because I had never wrapped a moccasin like this one before, which was amazing. Like the top of the moccasin was actually like 6 feet long or 5 feet long, like an entire deer height. And so I didn't wrap this moccasin, but when it was wrapped, I saw that it had to be kind of pulled taut to be wrapped in the right way. And so for that, it would be really good to have a stiff ethafoam support to actually kind of mimic someone's hard leg so that there's something to pull against. And I wanted to say something about that because I stuffed these moccasins when they came to me. They were already kind of loosely wrapped. And I just used just a regular batting, just a really soft one, because I thought it was fine. And they went on exhibit, and then a couple of museum employees that were from Santa Ana Pueblo came and said, "Oh, these don't look right," you know. And so we brought them back down, and they actually rewrapped them. And it was just a good lesson that you know, if you have people in your museum who have personal experience with the objects, it's like very awesome to take advantage of that, because you know, I've never wrapped a moccasin in my life, so I got to see that being done. And if I had known how they were wrapped before, I would have known that, you know, it would have been a lot better to create this stiff support. I thought of this when Nina gave me these moccasins to use, because I saw that, like, Nina obviously stores these moccasins flat like this, and you can tell that they're actually already creased a little bit. And so if these were in a museum, I would have just assumed that, you know, that crease happened because whoever put them in museums wanted to store them that way. But like, since I know that this crease came from Nina because she wanted to store them that way, and these are her moccasins, that would be an instance where maybe that's part of the story of the moccasins, because Nina liked to store them that way, you know? So this might be, that's like just another thing to think about. Like, I might go to the curator and say, like, hey, the person who put these in storage didn't make this crease, the owner made this crease, so do you want to stuff them, you know? So that was just something I thought about. Okay, so the method I just described by using the stockinette is the method that I've used at several different museums and for shoes and moccasins, all sorts of things. And it's pretty good, but sometimes you might have something that's a little fragile and you need to use something that's smoother than a stockinette. And in that case, there are other solutions that you can do. One solution is, Tyvek, you can sew Tyvek by hand, so you can make them the same way. However, it's a little bit hard to sew it by hand. You might hurt your thumb. So this would be a situation where I might sew most of the support, like 3 sides, especially the toe and the side, using a machine, and then turn it inside out, and then hand sew or machine sew the heel. And Tyvek, you can make it easier to work with by crumbling it up. It gets really, really soft if you keep crumbling it up, and also if you take it against a clean table and do that, it gets really soft and easy to work with. You can see it's not really stiff anymore. So that makes it a lot easier to work with and to sew with. So that's just one. Here you can see there was a snake that I found in the lab. This looks like it was hand sewn actually. So Tyvek can also be heat sealed with like a heat welder like this. However, it melts really easily, so it's really a delicate process. So I'd actually, if you get used to it and you find the perfect timing, you might want to do this, but you probably lose a lot of moccasin inserts before you get it right. And then one more method, if you're in a really big hurry, like you just need to stuff a moccasin quickly because it needs to be put in a box and sent someplace, or you don't have any resources at all, then there's that plastic bag that you can use. So, not this kind, but a trash bag. So it should say high density polyethylene. It should be USDA, FDA food grade quality. And if you're in a really big hurry, you can just stick your bag inside of your moccasin and then put some stuffing in it and then tie it up at the top. This, even though it's a trash bag, if it has those things, then those have been tested and they are archival. So a lot of museums actually use those trash bags in their long-term storage. So, and that's a good to know about just for other things too, because having just like a plastic barrier layer between an object and whatever else, like stretch wrap or something, is really good to know about. So you can use this for all sorts of other kinds of storage mounts too. Those are some methods that I've learned, and then I was really happy when Nicole taught me a method that she learned that I hadn't seen before, that you learned at the National Museum of American Indian, right?
Correct.
I'm going to hand it over. Thanks. It's really elegant.
So as Sophie said, I learned this technique at the National Museum of the American Indian as an conservation intern, and I have some handouts that you can pass around. I don't know if I have enough for everybody, but okay. They're available online. NMAI has published them, and they're available on this website, which is on the handout, and it's called STASH, which stands for Storage Techniques for Art, Science, and History, which is a good resource to check out. And so basically, this is a more involved insert than any of the ones that Sophie has gone over. So one of the cons of it is that it takes a little more time. But there are a lot of pros to it as well. It is made with the soft Tyvek, which you're passing around the little samples.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a sample you can keep, and if you feel it, one side is rough and one side is slick. And that is an important element to the material for making the inserts. The instructions that are published refer to the different sides, and ultimately this method involves using a sewing machine, and you do all of the sewing, and then you flip them inside or right side out, and all of the outside surfaces that are touching the moccasin are smooth. So that's the goal of this. So you have a really form-fitted, pretty passive internal support. So like I said, this is a pretty time-consuming, can be a time-consuming custom mount. So I'm not going to actually make one today, but I'm going to go through the directions a little bit and maybe point out a few things that I think are relevant and useful. Sophie went over, I think, all of these materials already. The moccasins are made of the soft Tyvek and felt, the polyester felt that has been passed around already. And the directions start with saying that you should make a pillow with the Tyvek and some polyester batting, which is like the snake that went around, but small, in order to, oh right, like this, in the small version, in order to kind of stuff out the front of the moccasin so you can kind of start to see the shape. I don't always do that. It's not always, this is a really great support, in particular for moccasins that have a lot of damage or are fragile or have other issues going on. So I would just like to say I don't always start with that step, especially if it seems like it might cause damage. So then, I'm gonna combine steps a little bit. So step one is to make the pillow, and then you also are gonna do some tracing, and we're making all of our measurements just setting the moccasin on top of our materials. And this will specify whether or not you want to be tracing and or sewing on the soft or the rough part of the slick or rough part of the Tyvek. So step one says you're gonna lay your moccasin on the rough side, and then you're just gonna trace around the perimeter, and then at the very back you're gonna measure out 1/2 inch, and you just kind of add just at a little 1/2 inch kind of towards the back, and that is gives you enough space for your seam allowance when you're.
And you're gonna trace with a pencil?
A pencil. I always use pencils. That's number one. For most conservation labs, you're generally working with pencils, especially if you're working around objects. So yes, good point, thank you. So you're tracing with a pencil, and so that's step one, and step two, you're essentially doing, so you get step one, your Tyvek, which I've already traced and cut out, and foam. This isn't actually foam, or this is foam. The material you're using is felt. Today I'm just using this as an example. So you can see I don't know if you can see, but there's a little mark at the back for the 1/2 inch. And then you can use this. You don't have to use your moccasin again to cut your felt to the exact size. So that's step 1 and 2, and 3. And then you're gonna measure for the vamp. And this, if you haven't stuffed it out, I generally just add a little more, I don't know, like 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch for clearance. Okay. So for the vamp, you put your Tyvek, you just lay it over the moccasin, and you trace on top of the Tyvek again with a pencil. And so you end up with these pieces. And you do the same with the felt. So you have your Tyvek and your felt. You pin them in place. You want to pin them, put the pins in perpendicularly so you get that height, and then you just sew around the perimeter. And that piece is ready to go. And then the next step is to measure for the back. And so again, You have your moccasin. You can just use a measuring tape, and you want to measure from where the vamp ends and around, and then you're gonna add 2 inches to that. So that's the felt that's gonna go around like this. And then you can measure, but you don't have to. You can just use this as your measuring tool. So this was, I know I already measured it, it's 15 inches. So then I'm gonna cut my Tyvek, 15 inches long, and that is also doubled wide. So your components are like this. And then here's an example of a pair of moccasins that I was making the inserts for, and this is, they're pinned out in about. And then step 9, kind of through 11, I've already talked about. So I've found ways to kind of combine steps, and you're also doing both moccasins at the same time. I would recommend doing all your measurements, all your cutting, and sewing as you go, and that definitely saves time. And I think when you get a feel for it, you can start combining steps, and that makes the process a bit faster. This is step 11, where the front is sewn. We've got the back pinned in place. So the last step is just to sew around, and you remove the pins as you're sewing around. And then once that was completely sewn, you just flip the whole thing inside out, and so it's hard to see, but this spot, here's the back, the Tyvek had been doubled, and so it can fold over inside. And you've got a nice clean seam there that you don't even have to sew. And you can see the felt inside, and it creates this very, really lovely smooth surface that's not gonna get caught on any loose materials or fragile materials on your moccasin. Here's an example of them inside. The directions also talk about if you do want to include, so if you would like to add more support, if there's a lot of beadwork on the top of the vamp and you want something more substantial, you can make these little Tyvek pillows and push them in, and because it's smooth surface, slick surface on slick surface, they actually go in really easily and come out very easily. And you can do that with tweezers or some of the tools that Sophie talked about. You don't always, so you can kind of scrunch them up and get them in there gently. And this is also, I just want to say, this is a pair of moccasins that I worked on as a more elaborate conservation treatment, and they had a lot of fragility and some damages. So this particular support was really a good option for them. And then here's an image from the back, and you can see I opted to put some pillows inside to give some additional support. And then this is just to say that, so you can see the one on the right has a missing heel. And one of the things I was able to do with the insert is to create a false heel and sew it directly onto the Tyvek and then insert it in. And it was a passive support and gave more form to the back of the heel. I think I'm gonna turn it back over to Sophie.
I just wanted to show a quick method of like an external moccasin support that's good for, especially for high moccasins, since, you know, even when the moccasin is stuffed completely, sorry, I try to avoid using the word stuffed, but even when it's fully supported, it still might not stand on its own. And you might not want to store it on its side just because, you know, there might be fringe or something else that might flatten and distort. So this is a solution that can have, where you can easily mount them standing up in their position. And so it requires using archival corrugated board, or just people call it blue board, and also Velara, and then some kind of like twill tape, like for instance there's that cotton twill tape you might see in museums, or this pictured right here is actually just a tape called Teflon. It's plumber's tape, and plumber's tape is like a polyfluorotetraethylene or something, but it's archival, and it's really good because that's also really, really smooth, so it's smoother than that twill tape. So here's some, sorry, bad pictures, but some examples. Basically, you're making like a half of a box, and then the moccasins sit inside that box, and you can wedge them in so that they don't move from side to side, but other than that, they just stay stagnant because you poke holes in the center, right here, and on the sides, and then you poke holes in the back, on the sides, and pull that string around to anchor them. So here's an example of a pair. You can see they just go around the edges, and then if they're tall moccasins, you'll bring them around the back as well. And it keeps them really nice and sturdy. Here it is. One note is that if you're not using the plumber's tape is really soft like Tyvek, so it's okay just to use the plumber's tape on it. But if you're using this tape, what I really like to do is to just cut a really thin strip of this. This is called Velara. It's just polyethylene foam. So when you bring it around your moccasin, I like to put a piece of the Velara in between the twill tape and the moccasin, and that helps to distribute the weight, because the last thing you want is for this to actually make an indentation into the moccasin. So you can put that in between, and I actually put just like a tiny little bit of glue in there just to keep it where it is. And that way if someone unties it, then this stays with it, so you don't lose that piece of Velara. And you can see how it just ties around the back, and you just poke a hole with an awl. So here are some diagrams for how to make it. So I had yeah, there it is. So the piece of blue board I was using wasn't big enough to make it the way it is there, but you can see this is kind of like the general shape. So if my board was long enough, it would actually come all the way out to here. And these tabs would be shorter, but basically they get glued like this, and then your moccasin goes inside, and you would just pull a strap through the bottom and pull a strap through the top, and it would just stay right in there. And I also like to, go through this first. Yeah, you would poke holes in those three areas. And for a short moccasin, it would just look like this. It's the same construction, just a different height. And then I also like to put, I'll cut the shape of the sole out of Velara and glue it to the bottom. And then you might also want to put a wedge right here in the front, or maybe it needs a little bit of extra, like a wedge in the back. So you can make a wedge out of just, cutting a little piece of Ethafoam, and like maybe you just need like a little wedge to go in between each moccasin on each side. So you just cut a little piece of Ethafoam and then glue a piece to Velara to each side. Even though it's okay for Ethafoam to touch your object, the Velara just gives it a little more soft surface. Yeah.
What kind of glue are you using?
Yeah, really great question. So yeah, it's good to use a glue that has been tested for its safety in museum collections. So I actually use, so this is one of my favorite glue guns. So it's called a polygun, and the glue is 3M. And you can get it just like on Amazon. And they sell an archival glue to go in here, but the archival glue smells really, really bad when you burn it, and I don't like it. So the just regular, it's called a high melt glue, because there's also low melt glue for this gun, but the high melt glue is the one you want to use, and it has been tested by conservators using a test called an ATI test. And it's not good for direct contact with the object, but it was deemed passable to be used in museum storage long term. So I don't know about glue that's just from like a glue gun that you buy at like Joann's at a craft store, so I might not use that kind of hot melt glue, but you could also probably find like an archival glue on like on the Gaylord site.
So it's called hot melt glue?
Hot melt glue, and it's the Polygon TC. There's also a version, so this one takes little tiny glue sticks, but there's a version that takes a long glue stick, and that's actually the one I like the best because then you don't need to keep changing them as you go. So I really recommend this glue, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of storage mounting and making boxes and stuff. So here's just a couple examples. Here are those boots in the beginning. And here are those shoes stuffed, and I made a little shoe support for them, and I also put them in a shoe box. So thank you so much for coming today, and if you